Welcome to Interpersonal Communication, Principles and Practice. When you finish each chapter of this book, you're going to re-enter the world with new tools to improve all of your relationships. You'll gain a new understanding of how communication works and how we can all do it better. Chapter 1 is called First, a Foundation, because in this chapter we'll lay out some tools that we can build upon throughout the course. Let's get going. Let's start by looking at our objectives for Chapter 1. At the beginning of each chapter in the book, you're going to find a list of objectives, and consider this your study guide for the chapter. It's a list of things that you should be able to explain or understand after you've read and studied the chapter. So I know students often ask for study guides before a quiz or exam. These objectives lists will make great study guides for you to go back to make sure that you've understood all the material in the chapter. So let's start by looking at our objectives for Chapter 1. After you study this chapter, you should be able to do these things. You should be able to define interpersonal communication. Now, I imagine everybody coming into this course has a notion of what interpersonal communication is. It can be challenging to articulate a specific definition. So we're going to put forth a specific definition that we will all use as our foundation going forward. You will learn to explain all three communication models. A model is a drawing or a flow chart or visual representation of a process. So we have three of those for the communication process, three different ways of looking at it that we will examine. You'll learn to differentiate among the different types of communication noise. Communication noise are things that interfere with messages, and we'll learn three specific types. You'll learn to explain the difference between channel-rich and channel-lean communication when we get to our discussion of communication channels. You'll learn to explain the influence of standpoint and how perception affects interpersonal communication. We all filter the stimuli in our environment through our own worldview, our own perceptual set. So you'll learn how that influences the way we encode and decode the messages that come in. You'll learn to differentiate between implicit and explicit social rules and why we follow those in our communication process. You'll learn to explain how social scripts affect interpersonal communication, and we'll define what those scripts are. You will learn about expectancy violation theory, which is a theory that explains why we react as we do when people don't behave as we expect them to, and what meanings we assign to their behavior when they don't do what we expect them to. And then finally, you'll learn to differentiate between the literal and relational components of interpersonal communication. Each communication message has both of these components. Let's define interpersonal communication so that we are all working from the same definition as we go forward. Our official definition for the course is going to be this. Interpersonal communication is a dyadic communication process in which people create shared meaning through the exchange of messages. Now that definition might seem a bit long and a bit wordy, so we're going to break it down, deconstruct it, and look at the important components of the definition. Starting with the word dyadic. We're told that interpersonal communication is dyadic. What does that mean? Well, a dyad means two. So this means it's a kind of communication that occurs between two people. And this differentiates interpersonal communication from group communication or mass communication, which have their own sets of rules and procedures and dynamics. So this kind of communication that we're studying in this course is what happens in the interaction between two people. We're told that it's a process. It's a dyadic communication process. What does that mean? Well, that differentiates communication from being an event. We might think of it as being an event. It's something that occurs in some snapshot of time. But communication is actually an ongoing process, not only during the conversation, but before and after the conversation happens, because we bring our own worldview, standpoint, perceptual set into the encounter, and we leave the encounter a changed person who re-enters the world with some different ideas. So it's a very dynamic and ongoing process rather than being a static one-time event. During this process, people are trying to create shared meaning. So I have an idea in my mind and I put it into words and I articulate it to you. I'm encoding a message. You decode it, but you are filtering your understanding through your own perceptual set. So what we're trying to do here is to achieve shared meaning, to get as close as we can to the idea in my head being the idea in your head when the exchange has taken place. And that can be challenging, and that's why we need a feedback loop, because we have to refine our understanding during the process sometimes. And we do this through the exchange of messages. So messages are going back and forth. They're not always verbal. So I might interpret your body language as feedback. I might interpret your tone of voice as feedback. I might even interpret your silence as feedback. If I send you a text message and you don't reply for a day, even that is sending me a message. And that message is coming to me through my perceptual set. So now that we've broken the definition down into these four ideas or these four components, let's go back and review it one more time and see if it makes a little more sense. Interpersonal communication is a dyadic communication process in which people create shared meaning through the exchange of messages. Before we delve into the three communication models, let's look at the elements of the communication process. These elements are going to be present in whatever form of interpersonal communication you are using. The first is the source. This is the originator of the message. So right now in this lecture, I am the source of the message. The source has to encode that message. In other words, render it into some kind of code that they hope that the receiver will be able to understand. So right now, I am rendering the thoughts in my head into the code of spoken English in order to send them to you. I am encoding a message, a series of thoughts or words that I want you to understand. I'm sending this encoded message to you through a channel. A channel is the vehicle that carries the message from person A to person B. So that might be the air in the room if we're speaking face to face, or in the case of this lecture, the channel is the computer. The channel is the recorded lecture. I'm sending this message through the channel to a receiver. That's you, the person who is going to be taking in the message and making sense of it. That receiver has to decode the message. So I encoded the message in order to send it to you. When you receive it, when the noise vibrates your eardrums, you have to be able to decode it. So think about what happens when a message is sent to you in a language that you don't understand, for example. You would have difficulty decoding that message. And these messages are coming to us through an environment of noise. And noise is anything that might distract us from receiving the message or decoding it properly. We'll look at several types of noise in a moment. So every time we have an interpersonal communication exchange, these are the things that are happening. A source encodes a message. sends that message through a channel to a receiver who then decodes the message, and this is all happening in an environment of noise. So the three communication models that we're going to look at will all incorporate these elements of the process. The three communication models that we'll be using in this course are called the linear model, the interaction model, and the transaction model. And we'll examine each one of these in detail in just a moment. But for now, let's think of the acronym LIT, L-I-T, linear, interaction, transaction. We call that acronym a mnemonic device, which is a brain trick that you can use to help you remember a list or the order that things come in. And in this case, it'll help you remember the order of complexity of these three models, with the linear being the simplest, the interaction model being slightly more sophisticated and complex, and then the transaction model being the most complex of the three. So LIT, linear, interaction, transaction. Let's start by examining the linear model of communication, which gives us a visual representation of one form of communication. The first model of communication, the simplest of the three, is the linear model. And when you think the word linear means line, you might remember from algebra class back in the day that linear describes a straight line. So this model of communication describes a situation where a source sends a message to a receiver in an environment of noise. So person A sends a message to person B. So this could be a note on the refrigerator, it could be a text message, it could be an audio recording like this lecture that you're listening to right now. It's very much a one-way form of communication. Person A sends a message to person B. Now this is a model of communication that if you ask most people to draw a picture of the communication process, this is what they might come up with. But as you look at it and you think on it, you probably realize that this is pretty simplified and there's more going on in most communication processes. There are other activities and other dynamics taking place. So the linear model serves as a foundation for what we're going to talk about, but it's not useful in very many situations. The second model we'll examine is called the interaction model. And think about what the word interaction means. It means action between. So in this case, the two parties involved in this communication process are both taking part. It's going back and forth between them. This is what you might call a turn-taking model of communication. So if you look at the picture here, look at the top part. It looks very similar to the linear model we just looked at. The source is sending a message to a receiver. But then the receiver becomes a source and sends a message back. So person A sends a message to B, then B sends a message to A. Back and forth, back and forth. A good example of this type of communication might be a job interview, where the source is the interviewer and the receiver is the person being interviewed. So the interviewer asks a question, the receiver takes that in and decodes it, but then they answer back. So the receiver becomes a source and sends a message back. So these messages are going back and forth. You could do this in a mediated format, such as text messages going back and forth, or you could do this in-person conversations, such as a question and answer session. But the important thing to remember about the interaction model is that the two parties are taking turns being source and receiver in the same conversation. The third communication model, and the most complex of the three, is called the transaction model. And in the transaction model, you can see that both parties are acting as source and receiver at the same time, and messages are going back and forth simultaneously. Now, this doesn't mean that we're talking over each other or that we're interrupting each other. This means that even as we are receiving a message, we're sending some kind of message back through our body language, our paralanguage, which is noises we might make, like uh-huh or hmm. Through our movement, you might move closer to the person or turn away from them as they're talking. And the person who's talking to you is then going to be receiving that as a message and interpreting it. So in this transaction model, both parties are reading all these different cues at the same time. You've got the actual message that's coming in. You might attach a meaning to the choice of channel the person is using. You might attach a meaning to their tone of voice, to the way they're sitting, to the way they gesture, to whether they maintain or avoid eye contact. All of those things are part of the way you decode their message. So in most face-to-face encounters where we have the ability to look at a lot of cues from the other person, that is going to be described by the transaction model. So when you look back over the three models that we've studied, the linear model being that one-way model, person A sending a message to person B, you might think of times in your life when you use that, such as when you send a text message to your friend just saying, I'm running late, I'll be there in 5 minutes. You're not even asking for or expecting a reply. It's very much a one-way message. The interaction model, the second one we studied, which was the turn-taking model, think of an email conversation that you've had with a professor, for example. Maybe you send me an email asking me a question. I email you back with a response. You email me back to say thank you or something like that. It's a turn-taking method of communicating. Then there is this third most complex way that's described by the transaction model, which most often happens when we are in the same environment face to face with the person and we are able to read a multitude of cues in order to decode the message, and we're adding all this other information into the way that we decode the message. Let's talk about a couple different types of channels that we might use to send our communication. Remember that the channel is the vehicle that carries the message, and we describe channels as being either lean or rich. So think of a lean channel as being a very skinny pipeline and a rich channel as being a very fat pipeline. And the difference is how many cues they can carry. So, for example, a lean channel carries very few cues for you to use to interpret the message. So, for example, if I leave you a note that says, buy milk, that note is a very lean channel. Other than the piece of paper and the words on it, you have no other cues for interpreting that message. You don't have my facial expression, my tone of voice. You don't know if I'm angry at you when I'm saying that, or exasperated, or if it was said with a smile. You don't know. That's why we call that a very lean channel. And you might remember that this chapter of the textbook started out with asking the question, is it okay to break up with somebody over text message? That would be an example of you choosing a very lean channel to deliver that kind of message. So consider whether that's an appropriate channel choice for that kind of message. Whereas rich channels are channels that allow the receiver to use a lot of different visual cues and oral cues and audible cues to interpret the message. So when I talk to you face to face, or if we do a FaceTime meeting on the internet, that's a richer channel because you can hear me and see me and use all the different cues in the environment to interpret the message I'm saying. So back to our example of using a text message to break up with somebody, you chose a lean channel there is that the appropriate type of channel for that type of message? I think a lot of people would say you need to choose a rich channel for that kind of message. You need to have that conversation in person, or maybe at least on the phone verbally or something like that. You need to, on the continuum from lean channels to rich channels, you might want to choose a richer channel for that kind of message. The choice of channel in and of itself sends a message to your conversational partner. If I choose a lean channel to send you a very personal message, for example, someone passed away or I'm breaking up with you, that might lead you to think that I don't care very much about you, or I'm not very concerned about your feelings. I'm kind of doing a hit and run if I'm delivering an emotional message that way. Whereas if I choose a rich channel and I come to you in person to talk about something that's very intimate and serious, that shows a level of empathy and caring as well. So the type of channel you choose not only helps the receiver to maybe interpret the message more clearly and more accurately, but the choice of channel also sends a message in and of itself. Something that all three of the communication models had in common was that the communication process was happening in an environment of noise. So I'd like to examine three types of communication noise with you. Now, when we hear the word noise, we usually think of sound, and that is one type of noise, but there are two others that can also interfere with messages. So let's look at all three types of communication noise. The first type is audible noise. This is sound. This is the kind of noise that vibrates your eardrums. If you and I are having a conversation outside on the sidewalk and an emergency vehicle goes by with its siren blaring and it drowns out our conversation, that would be an example of audible noise. If there's some sort of sound in the environment that is interfering with the message getting through. The second type we'll look at is called physiological noise. So think about what physiological means. Physical. This is interference that's happening inside your body. It's not necessarily audible. It's more things like you're having a really bad headache, and that's interfering with your messages getting through. Or you are hungry or thirsty, or you need to use the restroom, or you hurt your ankle and it's throbbing and it's distracting you from paying attention to the message that your conversational partner is telling you. Those would all be examples of physiological noise. So it's something bodily that is distracting you from paying attention. Sometimes if we're very nervous about speaking to somebody and we get that adrenaline rush and butterflies in our stomach, that could be a form of physiological noise that would stop you from articulating your message as clearly as you could. And thirdly, we have psychological noise. Think about what psychological means. It's something in your mind. So this type of noise is a distraction of thought. Perhaps you just had a fight with your significant other right before you talked to me, and now you're distracted and having a hard time articulating your message to me because you're emotional and you're thinking about what just happened. That would be psychological noise. Sometimes our minds get running on something and we kind of tune out from what we're supposed to be paying attention to. That's an example of psychological noise. If you've ever been talking to somebody and you got distracted by a thought and then you come back to the conversation and realized that you missed something, that would be an example of psychological noise interfering with that communication process. So these three kinds of noise, they're not mutually exclusive. They could all be happening in the same communication process, but everything that interferes with that message getting through clearly can be termed communication noise. Each of us filters the messages in our environment through our own perception, our own perceptual set. And our perceptual set is the set of ideas that we have about a certain action or behavior or way of speaking that's based on our own experience. So let me give you a couple of examples that might help. If someone says to you, I'm spending next week with family, and your own family is a very loving, supportive group of people where you feel safe and comfortable and loved, then you're filtering that word family through your own perceptual set and thinking that they're going to have a positive experience. But perhaps for your friend, family is a negative place. It's a place of conflict and hostility and not supportive and not safe. Now you say to your friend, oh, you're spending next week with family. That's great. That's going to be such a wonderful time for you. That's not the experience that they're anticipating, because you're filtering this idea of family through different perceptual sets. You're not having a meeting of the minds. You're not creating shared meaning in speaking about that. Another example would be if I tell you that so-and-so is a very religious person. You have your own perceptual set of what a religious person acts like, speaks like, thinks like, based on your own past experience. So you might think of a very religious person as someone who is very kind or someone who is very critical based on your own experience. Stigma is a kind of collective perceptual set. Stigma happens at the cultural level. An example would be 100 years ago, smoking was considered glamorous. Nowadays, smoking in public places is usually frowned upon in North American culture. So we would say that smoking is stigmatized. Sometimes mental health issues are stigmatized, or physical problems can be stigmatized. We might think that a person deserves an illness, or a person isn't strong enough to cope with something that they should be, based on these cultural ideas of stigma. And again, they can vary from place to place. We might attach a meaning of rudeness or a lack of discipline to a certain behavior in our culture, whereas it's perfectly acceptable somewhere else. These ideas all feed into the concept of standpoint. And in the chapter, I give you a very brief overview of standpoint theory. It's a lot more complex than the way we're using it here, but the metaphor of people in a landscape is very useful for understanding these ideas of perception. Imagine that we're all standing in a landscape looking out over it, and we're all standing in slightly different places, so certain features of that landscape are going to be foregrounded or backgrounded, and we're all going to describe it differently based on our proximity to it and our experience with it. So think of an accident that happens on a street corner, and you have 4 different people standing on each corner, and you ask them to describe what happened. Well, you'll have different descriptions based on their physical point of view of the accident and also their own perceptual set. Was the car going too fast? Did the driver seem remorseful that they hit the other person? You're going to get 4 different stories from those 4 different people. So that's a good illustration of this idea of standpoint and perceptual set. Our communication choices are also governed by social rules and social scripts. Now, there are a number of different kinds of social rules. We're going to look at two of them in this chapter. The first being explicit rules. Explicit rules are rules that are told to us, that are spelled out for us, that we are taught. So an example might be when you're a kid, maybe you were told, don't talk with your mouth full or don't bring your cell phone to the dinner table. Roommates often develop explicit rules between them. They discuss things and come to an agreement on, are we allowed to eat each other's food? Can we borrow each other's clothes without asking? Do I have to notify my roommate in advance if I'm going to have an overnight guest? So those kind of rules are spelled out, spoken, articulated. On the other hand, there are implicit rules. Implicit rules are not necessarily taught to us or articulated. They're rules that we expect other members of our culture to understand and to know. So if you are invited to a certain kind of event, you might know that you're expected to dress up for that. That would be an implicit rule. Nobody told you what to wear, but you know that you're supposed to do that. We have certain rules of etiquette for how we behave on an elevator, for example. Which way do you face when you get on an elevator? Well, most of us stand facing the door. Does anybody tell us we have to do that? No, but it's kind of an implicit rule of elevator riding with other people. These ideas of explicit and implicit rules lead us into the idea of social scripts. Now think about what a script looks like. If you've ever been in a play, you know what a script looks like. It gives you the order of what the people do and what they say. So we have social scripts for what to do and say in different situations. For example, imagine that you go to a fancy sit-down restaurant. Well, you know that you should probably make a reservation in advance. When you go in, you report to the host stand at the front and tell them your name. You expect someone to seat you, lead you to a table and seat you and give you menus. You expect that they'll take your drinks order first. You have this idea of what the chain of events is going to be and who the players are. That's an example of a social script. And again, these can be very cultural and they can be very implicit. Nobody's necessarily going to explain it to you, but you are expected to know. Another example might be if you are invited to a wedding. Every culture has a different social script for a wedding. In American culture, if you're attending a traditional American church wedding, you might expect that there's going to be music, that you're going to be seated on the bride's side or the groom's side, that the bride will wear a long white dress, that the groom will wear a suit or a tuxedo, that as a guest there are certain ways that you should behave. You're going to bring a gift. You might expect there to be some sort of refreshments or a meal afterwards. That is the social script for a rather traditional wedding. Again, if you're a member of a particular culture, you are expected to know these things. What happens when somebody doesn't know the social script? Well, expectancy violation theory attempts to explain how we react and what meaning we assign to a person's behavior when they don't follow the social script, when they violate social norms. How do we react and what meaning do we attach to their violation? How does that affect our perception of them and our communication process? And there are two ways that we look at a violation of social norms. We consider the context and the valence of the violation in order to assign a meaning to it. So let's talk about what these things mean. First, context. What is the context of the violation? Well, It's the situation in which the violation takes place. So, running out of the house and into the street in the middle of the night in your underwear might be considered a violation of social norms under most circumstances. But if the house is on fire, then it's understandable and forgivable. So the context of the house being on fire causes us to assign a different meaning to that behavior than we would under more ordinary circumstances. So that's the meaning of context. We consider the situation in which the violation took place and whether it is understandable. The other thing we consider is the valence, and valence of the violation means how bad is it? How good or bad is it? It might only be slightly off the norm, or it might be very, very far from the norm. So we think about the context it happened in and how far from the norm is it when we assign a meaning to it. Do we just assume that the person doesn't understand the social norm? Do we understand that they are deliberately flouting the social norm? Do we assign a meaning of rudeness to what's happening? We examine every violation in these terms when we're deciding what it means. Each of the communication messages that we send and receive has both a literal and a relational component. The literal component is the content of the message. The relational component is what might its secondary meaning be given the relationship between the people. What is the subtext? What might they be saying between the lines? So let's look at the literal and relational components of an example. Say the phrase is, "You didn't take out the trash." The literal meaning of that is, you didn't take out the trash. The trash is here, you didn't take it out. That is the factual meaning of that statement. But the relational component of that statement could be really complex. It could be, you didn't take out the trash and you're lazy. It could be, you didn't take out the trash and you never help out around here. It could be, you didn't take out the trash and I can't depend on you. It could be, you didn't take out the trash and you've let me down again. So the literal meaning is the same in every case, but the relational component depends on the relationship and history between the people and what is the subtext or secondary meaning of the statement. Throughout this course, we're going to be working on developing and improving our communication competence. And there are many elements to communication competence. Here are 3 important ones: awareness of self, awareness of others, and awareness of context. We need to increase our attention to what is going on in order to become more effective. So the first element here, awareness of self. Understanding our own motivations and limitations. Why are we making the choices we're making? What perceptual set are we working from? What preconceived attitudes might we be bringing to the communication process? Secondly, awareness of others. Learning to appreciate that our conversational partner is communicating from a different perceptual set and standpoint than we are. Understanding that our conversational partner might have a different experience with explicit and implicit social rules than we do, and making allowances for those things in our communication process in order to come to a closer meeting of the minds. And thirdly, awareness of context, awareness of how situational factors can change the meaning of a communication message the same message needs to be interpreted differently in different contexts. So heightening our awareness to context and all of these other issues is going to result in a more productive and more fruitful encounter with another person. Those are some highlights and examples of Chapter 1. Be sure to read the chapter thoroughly and contact your instructors with any questions. We'll see you in the next chapter.